So for the last 2 months, we've been talking about influencers, from planning and identification to execution, analytics, and measurement. And we're going to shift the conversation a little bit and talk about audiences, but many of the same rules and characteristics apply. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, who really is my audience? Now, it seems like a very basic question, but it's actually more complex than you think. And it really goes back to the concept of supply and demand. Is your supply of content meeting the demand of your audience? So before we jump back into the data, I want to talk quickly about content, contextualize it, and make it relevant to today's conversation. Now, quickly from a paid media perspective, all the content that you publish in the marketplace for your ads, your paid social, your paid search, all the creative, the videos, you have full control over the narrative. You have full control over the creative and everything that you publish and that you pay for. Now, it's expensive, but you do have control. From an earned media standpoint, at the very basic level, it's your press releases that you put on your website. If you do that, again, I hope you don't. If you have a strong media relations strategist, you can directionally position your narrative with friendly media so that it aligns to kind of how you want to position yourself in the marketplace. And shared media is another way of saying social media. It's a shared space between you and your customers. It's the place where you publish content on your Facebook page, your LinkedIn groups, your Twitter account. And while you have full control over what you publish in the marketplace, you always have to be prepared to defend it, because if you do something wrong or you're not being transparent about something, you will get called out for it. And then lastly is the owned media. And this is what I call the old school of content. This is the metadata. This is the websites. This is the press releases, the newsroom, or your storytelling hub. Now, again, you have control or somewhat control over the content that you publish in the marketplace, meaning you can gather data and insights to inform that content so that it performs better and so that it reaches audiences in the channels where they spend the most time. Okay, so back to audiences. Now, again, it seems like a very basic and elementary question to ask, but I bet if you were to ask someone internally who their audience is and they work in marketing or PR, the answers are going to be different, because most likely they are. If you work in PR, your audience is traditional media or analysts. And in marketing, it's most likely the end user or the customer. And this question is very important because you have to analyze the audience to then pull insights that will then inform the content that you're creating. And that's the whole purpose of this video. So for today's conversation, we're going to talk about one specific audience, and that is software developers. Now, there are literally hundreds of ways to build audiences. And in this case, we used a biosearch for keywords like software developer, programmer, and software engineer. From there, we found 9 sub-audiences. I often refer to them as segments. And they're segmented based on several factors like affinities, demographics, or how they identify themselves within their bio. Some might refer to themselves as a .NET developer, Python developer, Ruby on Rails. So rather than looking at the developer audience as a whole, we can look at these specific segments, compare them to one another, and really get insights that can inform content around specific audience groups, or in this case, developers. And this is what I would refer to as a data-informed persona, not a template. It's not intuition or an idea. This is real data, and it's based on the developers that we've looked at. Now, again, this is not the entire developer panel. This is that one segment that we call Python and machine learning engineers. In fact, it's not until you compare one segment to another that you realize how different they are. Now, we use a platform called Audience, which uses AI and machine learning to segment audiences and find the interests and characteristics that make them unique. They also have pretty tight integration with IBM Watson, which produces some pretty amazing insights. So I'm not going to talk about each data point on this slide, but I am going to talk about a few that I think are actionable for your content strategy. Now, this data is based on follower relationships. It's calculated against a general population. It's not conversational data. We're actually going to talk about that in the coming weeks. Again, this is follower relationships based on a specific audience group of developers and a segment of Python and machine learning. This first quadrant we're going to look at is the buying mindset. And what this tells me is that the top 2 characteristics that drive purchase are the utility of a product and word of mouth. Now, product utility, it can help you formulate a narrative that positions how useful your product is to the software development process. The second point tells me that if your customers are Python developers, it might make sense to formalize an influencer and/or software advocacy program. Now, I want to talk about influencers mainly because we've been talking about them for the past 4 or 5 weeks, and these are not topical-based influencers, right? Before we looked at influencers around digital transformation or security. In this case, these are people who are extremely influential to these Python developers, okay? A high percentage of these developers follow people on this list. These are not journalists. These are not consultants or analysts. These are other developers. Now, top communities and conferences, not really relevant to your content strategy, but you probably want to get this data to your event marketing team, right? If you know that certain developers are going to be at a certain conference, you might want to have some type of presence there. Now, you might not sponsor a booth, but you might send some salespeople or some subject matter experts to these conferences to engage with these particular developers. The unique media affinities tells us which technology publications are most followed by this audience. Now, the data here is all about your distribution strategy. Now, if you work in PR, you need to give this list to your PR team because you can use this to inform your top media relationships, or you can prioritize planning around who you're going to target for the next announcement. Now, the digital marketing team can use the same exact data, but they may want to buy some display advertising on some of these sites in order to reach the developers. You can do that through the Google Display Network or sometimes through direct media buys or sponsorships. And for your social content team, these are sites that you want to be monitoring. You want to see what influencers, what journalists are publishing content on these sites and which ones are gaining traction and trending, so then you can use that to inform your real-time content creation process. Let me just recap just for a few moments here before we end our precious time together. This data is actionable. From a distribution standpoint, we know what channels they're using. We know what media publications they're reading. You can use that data to make sure that your content is where they're spending their time, right? It's fishing where the fish are. Thank you. Thank you for your support. Please take care of yourself as we are going through this coronavirus challenge at the moment. And I will see you next week. And until then, hope you have a great week. Talk to you soon.